There's nothing better than rolling into a town you haven't been in before, and you're absolutely off your face.
Steamed.
And you're covered in blood because you've been fighting in the woods. So you go to one of the troughs and you wash yourself down, and while you're doing it, you get lifting your leg and you're farting and everyone's coming by you. And you're talking to people and you're pointing at them in their face.
You're choosing to do all of it.
Yeah, you're choosing to do all this. Henry's absolutely, he's slozzled. He's like, I'll do it for you. I'll make it worth your while.
Josh Brown, is Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 good?
I'm having a very fun time with it, Scott Tilford. And I kind of want to preface this preview with the fact that about 7 years ago, we also got the chance to do a review of Kingdom Come Deliverance 1. It's a game that, at the time, I bounced off massively after the first only couple of hours. I thought, at least at the time, it was a little bit obtuse. Now, in hindsight, however, and maybe that's an understatement, by the way, a little bit obtuse, but in hindsight, after having played similar games like it, games that offer up a bit more friction, I have always wondered whether it was a bit of a skill issue on my part and whether I treated it whether I met it on its own terms.
Yes, that seems to be the overall thing. Me and Josh did a video, and maybe there'll already be footage of this on the screen.
Please don't.
God help us if...
Don't. I don't want to see that. I don't want to see myself back
A lot happened. A global pandemic happened across the last 7 years, but me and Josh were 5-year-olds when we reported on the original Kingdom Come Deliverance. However, the video that we did back then was how it was an RPG for people who don't like RPGs or don't like video games. The point being that it's incredibly obtuse, it's incredibly off-putting, and you can spend ages in the original Kingdom Come just learning to block in the right direction or falling off the side of a ledge and breaking a leg and having to walk all the way back to your homestead to get treated or whatever. Realism to a fault is the argument in that direction. However, like you said, there have been a lot of games released since then, the rise of the survival genre, especially the popularity of that stuff, and something like Red Dead Redemption 2, which is incredibly slow in parts, the camp scenes, whatever, that idea of virtual reality without the goggles. And I think Kingdom Come was just a little bit ahead of its time in terms, obviously it has its fans, that's why we're getting a sequel, but it's interesting going, how much do you try and ease things, or do you just steer into the brutality and people will deal with it?
Yeah, you know what, I can't wait to finish playing this game so I can go back to that original, because I desperately think it needs a reappraisal from me personally. I think I'll get so much more out of it now, especially having played the second one. I played about 15 to 20 hours, probably close to the 20-hour mark of the first area, and it gripped me much quicker than the original did. It starts, essentially, you are Henry, who you were playing as in the first game. You have ascended some of the ranks. You know the skills that you had to learn at the start of that first game, sword fighting, archery, stealth kills, how to ride a horse, stuff like that. So you're starting at a level of knowledge and experience that you didn't quite have in the first game. But what this second title does is it doesn't reset your status, but it comes up with a premise whereby you are in a brand new land this time around. No one knows who you are. No one necessarily trusts you. And through a series of events that I kind of won't spoil here, you end up with barely a pot to piss in, let's say. You end up with not even the clothes on your back. You end up in a situation where you have to try to prove to the people who run these towns that you are who you say you are.
You're a good lad.
The mission that you're on is not just a drunken fabrication. It's like actually real. So it finds a nice balance, I think, in sort of resetting the stage in this brand new place while still giving Henry and you, the player, that kind of sort of instant mechanical satisfaction of being able to sword fight quite quickly, of being able to use a bow and arrow, and you get into fights, at least from my experience, way quicker than I ever did in the first game. There are a lot of fist fights, there are a lot of sword fights, and that initially for me, as someone who doesn't have much experience with the first game, the first few hours are a little bit overwhelming, but in a good way, Scott Tilford. Like I said, when you first pick up as Henry in the open world proper after a quite lengthy tutorial that is way more linear, you don't even have a shirt on. You're essentially like thrown in the dirt, right? Your first objectives are find a shirt so you're presentable, get some money, figure out just like get your bearings in this new village. And that takes a little while, but even that in and of itself is so satisfying to achieve, and it's a cool way to start one of these games.
Well, the original one was all about, like, because the thing is, I think this is going to make for an immaculate trilogy when it's done. Like, I think the idea of charting, like, the version of Henry that you get at the beginning of the first one, all the way through, I have to assume at this point, will lead to incredible things. Because at the very, very beginning, you're just smithing a saw. You're just doing basic things in the village. You're learning to fight, like we said. You're learning to hunt, like, really, really basic things that take a very long time. I did want to mention, because the way you're describing the premise, or at least the beginning of it, is the sense of humor intact. Because Kingdom Come has literally my favorite drunk scene in a game ever. There's a whole thing in Kingdom Come Deliverance 1 where you're trying to help like a vicar or a priest, and you go out on the town, you get absolutely hammered, then you have to deliver a sermon the next day, but you're both absolutely out of it. It's a bit of a precursor, like I mentioned Red Dead 2 before, but a bit of a precursor to the Lenny scenes from Red Dead 2. Oh, Lenny! And they're great. And I feel like Kingdom Come kind of got there first. But at the same time, I love that they're kind of playing their best hand first, best card first, and being like, what if we just opened the game on the high of the original one?
Well, that's it. In the writing and the humor it's honestly another thing that I kind of brushed up against in the first game, because that kind of ye olde England time, I'm swearing and using the word cock over and over again.
WWE on Netflix,
sometimes doesn't do much for me, but I have taken to the writing much more this time around because the characterization is so strong and can be so humorous. You mentioned a drunken scene there in the first game that I didn't experience, but I experienced one in the second game literally last night, where I was with the boys around a campfire and I was trying to win their favor, and I was getting absolutely sloshed on mead, and you kind of get into a situation where you're following this guy who you've been drinking with into the woods, and you're kind of having a sing-song with each other. You're farting, you're burping, you're getting...
the Fulton count, is that a button?
It's not, tragically. But that's almost funnier, man, because you can... I'm getting ahead of myself, but to finish this mission off, you're walking through the forest, you're singing, you're farting, you're burping, and it's just like fun. It is that let it sing from Red Dead 2. You're talking to a dog that is literally talking back to you because you're that drunk and you don't know where you are. So there are those kind of like smaller scale missions that make up the bulk
this is
of
great.
the game. But I love that as someone who always likes to play something like Skyrim or Oblivion as not the chosen one, if that makes sense, with a grand destiny or whatever. I like the mundanity almost, or the humanity of settings like this. And this game and the original really forefronts that. I mean, just from the very beginning, when you come into this new land, you're with a gang of other people. And I think any other game would have made you the leader. This time, you're the right-hand man to a noble, and he treats you as such. You're friends, but there are there are moments where you might overstep the mark and he'll berate you for it because you need to know your place and stuff like that. So I like having a place in the world, and that definitely comes through the entire thing. But even stuff like getting drunk, right? That has an impact on the game world itself, and I really like how reactive the world of Kingdom Come 2 seems to be. So just kind of, even outside of those scripted scenes where you are getting drunk with the boys, if you have a drink before you go into a town, comedy ensues, Scott Tailford. There's nothing better than rolling into a town you haven't been in before, and you're absolutely off your face,
steamed,
and you're covered in blood because you've been fighting in the woods. So you go to one of the troughs and you wash yourself down, and while you're doing it, you get lifting your leg and you're farting, and everyone's coming by you, and you're talking to people and you're pointing at them in their face. And
you're choosing to do all of it.
Yeah, you're choosing to do all this. Henry's absolutely, he's slozzled. He's like, I'll do it for you. I'll make it worth your while. Stuff like that, and how you...
Why is this not front-loading the marketing? Why is this not... They should be... Okay.
I know, man. Stuff like that, and how you personalize who Henry is and how you personalize your play style. It's brought that kind of role-playing goodness that I personally really enjoy, and I'm interested to see if that develops and how that develops and how much say I have the story, how much say I have on the story, as the game progresses. But yeah, lots more to talk about. Do you have anything to say about that drunken recollection?
All infinite things. Henry the Viper Higgins is... reference for about 20 people who are watching this video. However, I do want to pivot into the specifics of the gameplay. Like, that idea of having those things be controllable is awesome. I do want to ask about the sword combat, general hand-to-hand stuff. Is it way more responsive? Like, what are your options in combat? Is there an upgrade tree? Like, just what's that stuff feel like?
Well, yeah, so combat, like the first game, it works on a system whereby you sort of engage an enemy and you get a directional input as to where you want to hit them. So whether you're brawling or using a sword or a mace or whatever, you're trying to find openings in their attack. So they might have, they might be be holding their thing there, so you attack from down here and they can still block you and whatnot. And it is this kind of back and forth. You can maybe brute force your way through, but because you're having to deal with what they're doing and protect their attacks while dealing with your own stamina bar and trying not to deplete that, then on top of that, you've got dodges that you can perform, parries, which is the way that I've been playing, which then you can hit them with a riposte if you get a perfect parry and stuff like that. So it's quite tactical in that nature. It is more fluid than I remember the first game being. It's still a little bit cumbersome, it's still a little bit clunky, but I find it satisfying. It feels very satisfying to get good at it. Like when you first start the game and you're trying to brawl with someone and they're constantly locking you in a little wrestling move, or they're just beating the absolute crap out of you, you get to like learn combos, you get to learn how to read what enemies are going to do. And when you get to the point where you can master a fist fight, or you can learn new sword techniques, so you can go toe to toe with 4 people at once or whatever, that sort of sense of progression is good. But again, similar to the first one, but not as in an extreme way. It might make for a bit of a dodgy first impression where you're a bit overwhelmed or thinking, I can't do anything, but you're not supposed to. You're supposed to start a little bit smaller scale and kind of work your way up to those bigger encounters. But I will say that those bigger encounters come much quicker than they did for me in that first game. You can get to fighting, multiple people at once, like 5 hours in or something.
I honestly love the confidence of this. There's a rare quality in art, in media, or whatever, confidence in restraint. I feel like being able to chart that like difference, like I said, from the first game to this, where you go from struggling to just go toe to toe with someone, which they replicate a bit of, like you said, in 2, but then you go from struggling to fight even the guy that's training you in the first game, to then being able to take on multiple dudes at once. Like that's a really cool progression. My overall thing is just that they went for something in the first game that I think enough people latched onto, where it was like, we see what you're going for, this vision of a hyper-realistic old school, medieval style RPG. And then the sequel to me hasn't had that much advertising, hasn't had that much marketing. Like I think a lot of people know it's coming, but it's kind of just on the side. Like this year is absolutely rammed with stuff, especially if GTA 6 ends up coming later in the year. But overall, this is just a preview thing, but your overall impressions are better game. They've tried more stuff. They've nailed a lot of the things that they were a bit more furtive at the beginning.
Totally. I mean, so far, I can't stop playing it, and like I said, I know it was a long time ago, but I bounced straight off the original, but this has made me appreciate it so much more. I'm really excited to see where the story goes, because I barely scratched the surface of that, man. Like the first act thrust is essentially, you need to get into a wedding, go off and figure that out. You get a few prompts, you might be able to go help this person or help that person, and maybe they'll be able to get you an invite down the line. But after you get through that opening, it's very freeform, and just living in that world has been a joy. Discovering like different factions that are within it, doing activities for them, and doing these long quest threads that constantly have you going back and forth between places, and really engaging with characters and getting to know them, which makes, maybe eventual moments where you lose reputation with them or they turn on you or something, that bit more impactful, because it's not just like in some other RPGs where you meet someone once, you forget them, you forget their face, you never think about them again. So far, it's a bit more in-depth than that. I do have some negatives that I'm a bit not worried about, but that have cropped up that I'm interested to see if they spiral out into something more as the game goes on. I told you before about how reactive the world is. For instance, when you get drunk and people will react to you accordingly. Like that is impressive, but the reputation system, at least now, can feel a little bit wonky. Right. For instance, I was doing quests for a faction. I won't spoil what they were, but essentially, I was in very good stead with them, Scott. Is you are doing deeds for them that are as nice and are as good as you can do for any person. Okay. They would be in your debt for a long time, put it that way. And in the main cutscenes and in the main dialogue of the quest itself, it all made sense how they were reacting to me. But because my reputation in that whole area was very low, because I got caught punching a bunch of guys, sorry. As soon as the quest sort of ended and then I interacted with them again to trade or just to ask them what was going on, their entire demeanor would change, and they'd call me like, I don't know, they'd shout at me, they'd call me a mad fart, and they'd say, your kind isn't wanted around here and stuff like that. So that kind of disconnect between how people act in quests and how people act in the open world is a bit of a shame. I know it's a big ask perhaps, but it does make the actions of your character in the missions sort of sometimes jar with your overall reputation and how they mesh the two together. So that is one thing where I'm a bit like, I'm not so sure about that going forward. So it's going to be interesting to see when I start making those bigger decisions in the main quest, I imagine, how the world reacts to it. Because overall it is good, but that's happened more than a few times in my playthrough.
I feel like the whole thing with this style of game, and the most mainstream example I think is Red Dead Redemption 2, a game that a lot of people didn't finish, like maybe because of just how slavishly devoted it was to doing those slower segments and, you know, like brushing your horse's face or whatever it is and taking your time and having a can of beans for food in the morning. The thing that comes with that is that it's really easy, or you know, to be reminded that it's a video game every now and then when something like this happens, where it's like, oh, this meter wasn't high enough in the background, and then we need to like trigger this piece of dialogue instead. So it's, to me, that still comes across as like it's so ambitious to try it at all. But yeah, like it's going to be really hard to maintain that on like a 100 hour RPG.
I know I've been talking for a long time, but I got a few more things that I want to cover. Like there are like the way the game utilizes its RPG systems on top of the reputation. Like I really enjoy it. It is that sort of Oblivion style of leveling up, or Skyrim style, I think, of leveling up. It's been a long time since I've played that game. Where you are increasing your stats on things that you're doing in the actual world. So if you're, you know, hitting people with bows or crossbows, you're leveling up that stat. If you're doing a lot of fist fighting, you're leveling up that stat. And I like that the world adapts to your play style rather than you just arbitrarily putting in points to certain attributes or perks and whatnot. So that's my preferred method of role-playing, truth be told, but it is something worth noting. And something else worth noting, the game, even though it's better than the first impression of the first one, still takes a little while to get going. All the stuff I've talked about so far has been in the open world itself, but it does take a couple of hours to get there, and it starts in media res, so you are starting in like a siege of this big battle.
Media
as a
res?
character, starting in the thick of an action from later on in the story. You start in...
Is that a film too?
It is.
Are we reaching the denouement, are we? Good lord. Watch out for the mise en scène while you're in.
You use one phrase and then this guy's going to hold it against me. Really. So you start in a section, in a set piece, where this castle is under siege and you're a different character, I think. And then you jump 2 weeks back. But that initial siege is so action heavy that it, in the action isn't necessarily made for scenes like it. So it can feel a bit weird and jarring and not great to be sword fighting before you even really know how to use a sword, or same with the crossbow. Then you jump into a few lengthy cutscenes and you're doing, again, more tutorials, learning how to fight, which are necessary, but there are a lot of them before you get the sort of leash taken off you, as it were. So it's not that that stuff is bad, it's just, it's worth knowing that that's not necessarily representative of how the game is going to be structured going forward. It is just that kind of lengthy intro that you would get in something like Red Dead 2, you know, when
It's
you come
almost
down the mountain.
like a studio note or a, like a publisher's note.
Yeah.
We should try and hook him in, do something. And then you've got like Daniel Vavra and the dudes at Warhorse being like, that's not really what the game is.
I know, it's interesting. I'd like to see what the thought process was, because again, I don't know the whole story, but I do think the starting point when you actually take control of Henry those few weeks prior, like that works as a starting point. There's enough mystery, there's enough intrigue, there's a nice inciting moment. I don't think you need that bit with the siege necessarily, especially because I think it implies perhaps way more action than you're going to get over those few hours anyway. It's not a deal breaker or anything, but yeah, you might want to get to the open world first, at the very least, rather than judge it on that first 2 hour stint. But other than that, Scott, I'm excited to see where it goes. I hope it manages to maintain this momentum. The thing looks beautiful, and it's an RPG in that classic Oblivion style, which I really like. So I want to go home now and play more. Put it that way.